Hi everyone. So, as I said, I'm preparing a bit of a different episode, but a lot of things going on this week. Got a little busy with family life. I don't know if I've mentioned it, but I have two little kids and they keep me busy, and there's always things going on with school, etc., etc. So, I'm working on the new type of episode that I said. But for now, I'm bringing you a little bonus. It's a story from a contributor. I found this story very interesting, and I hope you do too. I apologize up front for the length of the story, but there is so much baggage in it that I have to do a gradual build-up of the events. When I was around 18 months old, my mom married my stepfather. I didn't remember a father in my life before him, and he has always been my dad. I was spoiled and indulged as a child, even after the birth of my younger siblings. I was always daddy's girl. My paternal grandfather was gentle and attentive without being as indulgent as my dad. I loved his teddy bear hugs and how he always smelled like cherry pipe tobacco. I believe this is why it was such a shock to me when my grandmother treated my mom and I like parasites. My grandmother was the skinny, sour-faced chain smoker that only moved from her chair to refill her coffee cup. My brothers and I knew from very young that once we arrived at the grandparents' house, we were to immediately go into the den and play quietly until it was time to leave. On a side note, even before my brothers were born, I would be dropped off in the den to play by myself. Quite often, the adults would hear me talking to myself, toddler babble with few understandable words, and they would come to check on me. When they asked me what I was doing, I would simply tell them that I was talking to the Indian. And no one knew what to make of it, but I wasn't in the slightest bit upset, so they left me alone. Consequently, this made the den at the grandparents sort of the safe place in the house. My mom even confirmed this to me a few years ago, saying it seemed to be the only bright spot in the whole house. However, there were times when you would have to venture out of that safe place to use the bathroom. It usually involved one of us timidly making our way out of the den, through the laundry room and into the kitchen where the adults were talking. We would stand in the archway between the dining room and the kitchen and wait to be noticed. It was nerve-wracking knowing waiting too long would be, I'm not sure why, but it would be disastrous. But walking through the house to get to the upstairs bathroom unescorted could get you in serious trouble. Here is where the first problem came in. The layout of the house was simple, but it involved moving from the den through the laundry room and into the dining room. The feel of the dining room was intimidating for two reasons. Number one, grandmother could see you, and there would always be a scowl of disapproval. Children were not meant to be seen unless she wanted you for something. And number two, you always felt like you were being stared down by something on the far side of the dining room. If you strayed too far into the dining room, there was a fear of something that could grab you from under the heavy sideboard. Once we had Mom's attention, she would immediately get up from the table and take us to the bathroom. Here's where the second problem came in. Number one, you had to go through the living room to reach the stairs. Heaven help you if it was already dark outside. since my grandparents didn't believe in leaving a light on in any room if they weren't physically in the room. If you were lucky, they left the upstairs hallway light on, which meant the staircase was well lit. Number 2, even the short walk from the dining room across the living room to the bottom of the stairs always made you feel like you were being chased. The relief of reaching the bathroom at the top of the stairs was twofold at that point. Now, for those of you chuckling and attributing everything to a child's fear of the dark, you couldn't be more wrong. My mom nodded and agreed with me that she hated having to use the bathroom at my grandparents' house after dark because of the walk through the living room, and she was usually grateful when one of us kids came to ask for a chaperone. This short walk, done even during the day, could be unnerving, as though you were being carefully watched and could be grabbed at any moment. This didn't go away as I got older either, but that explanation can wait a bit. Around the time I turned 6, my dad had a serious argument with his parents, though I wouldn't learn the content of the argument until long after my both grandparents had passed away. 2 years later, my dad decided to try to mend fences and took us over to visit. It was a very long visit, as I recall, and my dad was reluctant to leave, even after my brothers and I let my mom know that we were tired. In a stroke of malice or a sincere attempt at civility, I have never been sure which, my grandmother told my mom to bring my brothers and I into the dining room and let us crash on the floor until my dad was ready to leave. She even busied herself bringing several blankets and a few small throw pillows for us to sleep on. I remember being very nervous, since we were not only where grandmother could see us, but we were in close proximity to whatever it was that made us feel threatened in the dining room. My brothers curled up together close to the dining room table, where the feeling wasn't quite as strong. I was left to sleep either facing or with my back to the sideboard, where I knew this, entity crouched and waiting. I managed to lie there, staring at the ceiling and listening to the adults talk, only a few feet away. I pointedly ignored the skin-crawly sensation of being very carefully studied and watched, as though the thing was trying to decide if I was the only one it was after. Stubbornly refusing to acknowledge what I saw as a dreadful challenge, I finally decided to put my back to the sideboard and cuddled up against my younger brother. Tired as I was, I managed to fall asleep despite the threat. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I felt my younger brother stiffen up against me and I managed to pry an eye open. His little face was a strange mix of half asleep and absolutely terrified, and he was staring at something over my shoulder. My stomach immediately started to churn, and I reached out to touch his side briefly to get his attention. His eyes slid to mine and then snapped back to whatever it was. As my brain screamed at me not to, I rolled to my opposite side and found myself staring into two bright red eyes. My heart began to race with my lungs as though trying to see who could escape first. Somewhere in the cacophony of blood pounding in my ears, I began to hear a low growl, akin to the noise our German Shepherd would make at any stray snakes in our backyard. Then I saw a brief flash of white, which my overexcited brain said, "Teeth!" I bolted upright, scooting back against my brother to push him out of the way of whatever it was, and screamed loud enough to bring the roof down. My mom told me later I startled the adult so badly that my dad tipped over the chair he was sitting in, and my granddad nearly dropped his pipe. My mom came running in while I was in the process of trying to shove my brothers away from the dining room table and toward the archway to the den, the safe place. For a moment, and I'm still not sure I really saw it or not, there seemed to be a foggy figure of a man with dark hair standing in the archway. My mind had me believing that if I managed to get my brothers to him, he will protect them from this demon. However, it turned into a non-issue with my mom arriving on the scene in a matter of heartbeats and pulling all three of us into her arms. At that point, Mom announced that we were going home. My brothers never slept at the grandparents' house again. However, my experiences in that house were far from over. The visits to the grandparents' house continued throughout my teen years, and I managed to never see the damn thing again. The constant battle of wills with the chaser in the dark corners of the living room was ongoing, but its interest seemed to fade as I aged. Either that, or it was slowly starting to realize I wasn't afraid of it any longer. I would now boldly walk through the dark living room, even without the hall light on, stand at the bottom of the stairs, and flip the hall light on myself. I would probably make a show of deliberately taking my time and not racing up the stairs. To anyone else, the show probably would have been extremely funny to witness, but my stubborn streak would no longer let me run from this thing. Then came a rough patch for my family. My granddad had a series of strokes that left him wheelchair bound for nearly 2 years. And then, after another massive stroke, he passed. He was cremated and his ashes were given to my dad as per his wishes. This left my grandmother alone in the house. Suddenly, the house was too big for her, too quiet, and I suspected she had started to experience things herself. For no reason I can understand, my mom and dad asked me to temporarily move in with her to help keep an eye on her during the night. Whether it was the extra hour and a half commute to school every morning or the ridiculous amount of trigonometry homework I had, I operated in a sort of foggy haze that left me not noticing or caring about the odd goings-on in the house. The odd goings-on in the house. My schedule would put me on a bus at 6:15 a.m., pull through school and drama club until 6 p.m., be at my parents' house around 6:30 p.m. to have dinner, and then be taken to my grandmother's house around 7:30 p.m. to finish my homework and sleep. If there had been anything paying attention, I had no energy for them to feed from. My mom and dad eventually convinced grandmother to sell her house and move in with us. The house was put on the market and her things were moved into what amounted to a large walk-in closet off my parents' bedroom. For those thinking we stuck Granny in the closet, that wasn't the case. It was more of a small bedroom, complete with a full window and plenty of room for a bed, dresser, and desk. However, it wasn't long before the diagnosis of COPD came in for my grandmother, and she was forced to try to quit smoking after 40 plus years. The medication they gave her and sudden cold turkey theory of quitting the cancer sticks were a terrible combination for grandmother. She suddenly started seeing things growing out of the walls which no one else could see, heard things no one else could hear, and would cry randomly. After speaking with her doctors, the recommendation was to move grandmother into a senior living environment where they could monitor her condition better. Grandmother stayed a total grand of 3 weeks, announced she was done with my dad, and rented a mobile home. It was the last time I would ever see or speak to my grandmother. 6 months later, she was found in her mobile home, apparently dead of a heart attack, by a neighbor who hadn't seen her outside in 2 days. According to her wishes, she was cremated and mixed with Granddad's ashes in the same urn. Those ashes would stay on the top of my mom's china cabinet for 3 years before being spread on a piece of family-owned land. But there was still one piece of the story remaining: the house. Just before grandmother's death, the house finally sold to a couple from New Jersey with no children. Now, the only reason I mentioned that the couple was childless is due to a series of odd things which occurred in the years after they bought the house. My mom and dad were very friendly with the couple and made sure to make themselves available if they had any questions about the house. During the transition period, the couple asked my dad about someone to house sit for their 2 dogs and 2 cats while they were finalizing the sale of their house. It would take about 2 weeks, and then there would be a second period of about a week during the closing. My dad, absolutely without my permission or knowledge, I would have said a hard no. He volunteered me. At first, I was simply annoyed because I wasn't asked. This was the summer between my senior year of high school and starting college in the fall. I was already working and really didn't want to have to adapt my schedule even further to take care of someone else's pets. After a day's conversation with my friend, though, she pointed out 2 very important things to me. Number 1, I'd have an entire house to myself, no one to determine my schedule other than work. Number 2, they were paying a flat $500 for those 2 weeks in cash that would help towards the cost of textbooks and such in the fall. I went to my dad that night with one reservation: I would be in that house alone. I accepted and did my best to not dwell too much on my past experiences. I was introduced to the couple, shown a few changes I'd managed to make in 2 months in the house, and met their sweet furry critters, called Alex and Duke. I'd be staying with them for 2 weeks. I was given the far bedroom upstairs, which had been my youngest aunt's room in former days, and told to make myself at home. I waved goodbye from the front stoop, ushered the 2 dogs back into the house to refill their food dishes, and receive sloppy kisses and things. The feline element of the family was much hesitant, But that wasn't what caught my attention. I noticed that the cats just lay inside the archway of the dining room, watching something in the living room rather intently. Knowing the history of the living room, I refused to be drawn into that conversation just yet. Instead, I followed the wagging tail train into the den. The den had been set up as more of a family room now, with a large sofa on one wall, a huge television on a stand in the alcove where a chest freezer had been, and a computer desk in one corner. Wonderfully comfortable and welcoming. It felt almost like I was being hugged as I stood in the middle of the room and smiled out at the two scoundrels drooling at my feet. I popped on television and curled up on a couch with a furry body on either side of me. It was almost 11:30 p.m. when I realized I should get some sleep. I did have work tomorrow after all. The minute I stepped into the den, into the laundry room, it was as though I was stepping into a pressure cooker. Laundry room to dining room, the atmosphere was thick and soupy, like trying to breathe underwater. My stomach churned, and I could smell something awful, but had no idea where it was coming from. The elderly German shepherd, Duke, let out a low growl, but stopped still, finally turning around and going back into the den. He refused to leave the den unless it was to find food after that. The goofy golden lab, Alex, stood next to me, stuck still looking into the dining room, watching something keenly. I decided I simply needed to push through this and try to act nonchalant. As I walked through the dining room and into the living room, I was more than grateful that I'd thought to leave the hall light on for the stairs. Alex stayed so close to me that he bumped my leg with every step, but refused to let me go by myself. I cleared the stairs and made my way into the large back bedroom, Alex still carefully pacing me, but glancing back through the railings down the stairs every few steps. I spoke to him softly, calling him good dog and good boy, even once we reached the room. But he wouldn't go into the bedroom with me. Instead, he positioned his large frame on the floor in the door frame, in watchdog mode. I got changed and laid down to sleep, fully knowing it would be a miracle if I got any sleep that night. I woke sometime in the early hours of the morning to the sound of Alex's low growls from the doorway. The oppressive atmosphere from the dining room had somehow seeped into the hallway right outside the door. As I sat up and tried to remember where I was, Alex shot to his feet and started growling louder. Then I heard Duke start barking from downstairs. Suddenly there was a crash from downstairs, and it felt like every window in the house rattled. Alex stopped growling, and Duke's barking subsided. But there was a sudden sound of whispering voices, male and female all but tumbling over each other trying to talk. Pain bloomed behind my eyes, and it felt like my head was coming apart. It was only a few seconds before a sparkle of light flashed at the sides of my head and I realized I wasn't breathing. I forced air into my lungs and Alex came running into the room, nearly knocking me over trying to nuzzle me and lick my face. The whispering retreated and I sat shaking, trying to slow my breathing into a normal rhythm. I had been crying, either out of fear or pain, I didn't know, but Alex wasn't leaving me alone until he knew I was safe. We stayed that way until I saw the first peaks of sunlight streaming through the curtains. I dressed while Alex sat in the doorway, patiently waiting for me. Whatever it had been had dissipated, and I went into the bathroom to splash water on my face and consider whether I was conscious enough to attempt work that day. Alex sat posed at the top of the stairs, staring down into the living room. Duke was laying stretched across the bottom landing, watching the cats roll around in the sunshine. My early warning system and 2 guard dogs settled my nerves. I gave both lots of scratches and kisses before I left for the day. By the time I returned that afternoon, I had already decided I wasn't sleeping upstairs that night. I grabbed my bag from the bedroom, showered quickly, and took everything, including a pillow and spare blanket from the bed, down to the den and bunked on the couch for the rest of the 2 weeks. When the couple returned, we cut up for a few minutes in the kitchen. They paid me and asked if I would be interested in staying again when they went back for the closing. Much as I loved my 2 furry protectors at that point, I wasn't sure I could handle another 2 weeks sleeping in that house. I sighed and told them to call me when they had a date. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I came down with strep throat and pneumonia only a few days before they were to leave, and I wasn't leaving my comfy bed when I felt so miserable. It was truly the last time I was ever in my grandparents' house. There were a series of small fires throughout the house that did some minor damage over the course of 2 years. The husband became very sick, got complications with diabetes. The wife suffered a miscarriage after many years of trying to get pregnant. Duke passed away in the living room one night, and they woke up to Alex laying next to his friend and crying softly. Then, a fire that started in an upstairs bedroom, which ended up claiming the whole house. It was chalked up to faulty wiring, but the wife confided to us that the bedroom hadn't been used at all the time that they were in the house. They hadn't connected the lights there. They hadn't connected the power to there. They used it solely for storage and couldn't understand how the fire had even started. Thank you for staying with me through this bonus episode. Remember to please review, subscribe, rate, and if there's anyone you know that would enjoy this podcast, please let them know. Again, I'm so thankful for all of you guys that are listening. I was so glad that when I checked the statistics on the episode downloads and subscriptions, there are subscriptions and downloads coming from different states and maybe around 5 countries. I'm really happy about that. No matter how many subscribers or how many downloads I get, just the fact that I have the opportunity to speak through this platform and have people listening to me is so amazing. You can find me on Instagram, and I will always be uploading an audio stream of the episode on YouTube for those of you that prefer to listen to it on that platform. I'm also on Patreon if you inclined to contribute a little bit to the costs of hosting and making this podcast. As always, wherever you are, take care, have a good start to your day, or sweet dreams. Remember to stay tuned for my next episode. This has been Elise with And Then It Got Weird.